Good evening, councillors. Good evening, members of the public. I'm Jason Brock, leader of the council, chair of the policy committee. Welcome you all again to the policy committee, once again online, because social distancing rules are still in place. So we meet on this video conferencing platform instead of in person at the Civic. As with previous meetings, and for clarity, I'll ask members individually at the end of the debate on each report to state whether they are for, against, or wish to abstain from the recommendation before them at that stage. I will shortly ask members to introduce themselves for the benefits of the public and to ensure that everybody's in attendance as expected. Members, you'll all know the drill by now. If you keep your microphones on mute when you're not speaking, when you're called to speak, unmute your microphone, wait for a few seconds for the delay in connection. And you also need to remember to turn your camera on before you are called to speak, or you will not be visible during your contribution. And so hopefully all councillors have their cameras on now, ready for the roll call. As ever, we're at the mercy of broadband connections, so some people may lose connection, but so long as we still have 3 members in the meeting, we will be quorate. So on to the roll call. So as I've already said, I'm Jason Brock, leader of the council, and I will call the other members of the committee alphabetically. Councillor Barnett Ward.
Hi, I'm Councillor Barnett Ward, Caversham Ward Council, lead member for neighbourhoods and communities.
Councillor Devine.
Hello, it's Ricky Devine, Tylehurst Ward Councillor.
Councillor Jones.
Tony Jones, lead member for adult social care.
Councillor Page.
Councillor Tony Page, deputy leader of the council and lead member for environment planning and transport.
Councillor Rowland.
Hi, Councillor Karen Rowland, Abbey Ward Councillor and the lead member for culture, heritage and recreation.
Councillor Skeets.
Councillor Jeanette Skeets, Thames Ward Councillor and leader of the Conservative Group.
Councillor Stevens.
Good evening, Councillor David Stevens. I'm a councillor for Thames Ward. I'm the chairman of the Audit and Governance Committee.
Councillor Terry.
Councillor Terry, Minster Ward, lead member for Children's Services.
And Councillor White.
Evening everyone, Councillor Rob White, Park Ward Councillor and leader of the Green Group of Councillors.
Thank you, councillors, and I just want to introduce everybody, the public, especially to the officers in attendance tonight. They won't be on screen as much as the councillors, but it's right that everybody knows who they are and what their role is. So Peter Sloman is the council's chief executive. George Framalico is the deputy director of planning, transport and regulatory services. Mike Graham is our Assistant Director of Legal and Democratic Services and the Monitoring Officer. Francis Martin is our Executive Director of Economic Growth and Neighbourhood Services. Peter Moore is the Council's Head of Climate Strategy. Peter Robinson is the Interim Assistant Director of Finance. And Jackie Yates is our Executive Director of Resources and the Chief Financial Officer. Okay, takes us on then to item 2, declarations of interest. Nobody's notified me of any in advance, but I'll pause in case any member wishes to make a declaration. Wonderful, seems we're all sorted then, so we'll move on to item 3, minutes. Members, could I ask you to confirm that the minutes are a correct record of the meeting held on the 28th of September 2020?
Confirmed.
Agreed. Confirmed. Agreed.
Brilliant. Thank you, councillors. Minutes are approved and I'll sign them in due course. Probably, I don't know. There are lots of minutes waiting for my signature now. They're just backing up and backing up. So on to petitions and questions. So we have no petitions this evening, but we do have 2 questions, one from a member of the public and a question from Councillor White as well. So we'll take the public question first and then on to the question from Councillor White. So we have a question from Els de Metz. So Ms. de Metz, if I welcome you to the meeting and if you could press *6 on your handset to unmute yourself, and then when you're ready, ask your question. Are you there, Mr. Metz?
I think we might need to dial her back in, Chair.
Do you want to, if you do that then, Simon?
Sorry, I was just chatting away. Did it work this time?
Yes, I can hear you. If you could ask your question, please.
Brilliant, thank you. I have a question about the community infrastructure levy for Councillor Page, please. Can the council advise us of the planned publication date of its report on SIL funding, and also advise whether the report will be forward as well as backward looking? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Metz. Councillor Page to respond.
Thank you, Chair. I thank Mr. Metz for her question. As of 2020, the Council is required to publish an infrastructure funding statement, an IFS. The IFS reports on the collection, allocation and spend of contributions towards infrastructure from both the Community Infrastructure Levy, the SIL, and Section 106 agreements over the previous financial year, in this case 2019 to 20. This is required by amended SIL regulations that came into force in 2019. The Council will publish its IFS on our website before the deadline of 31st December 2020. No specific date has been identified as yet, as the process of collation of information is still underway, but it is expected to be during December. The IFS will cover the spend of both the strategic SIL, meaning the 80% which is used to fund infrastructure provision across Reading, and the neighbourhood SIL, which is the 15% of SIL which should be used for infrastructure in the local area in which development takes place. The IFS will be forward-looking in the sense that the SIL regulations require it to identify priorities for future spend of both SIL and Section 106. These priorities will need to be tied to the Council's existing policies and priorities in its local plan, adopted formally in November 2019. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Page. Mr. Metz, you may ask a supplementary question that seeks to clarify an element of Councillor Page's answer if you wish.
Yes, thank you. Please could you clarify the last sentence, because I don't understand exactly what you mean by that. So when you say the priorities will need to be tied to the Council's existing policies and priorities in its local plan adopted in November 2019. So does that mean that the decision on how to spend the money was made back in November 2019? Is that what that means?
No.
Councillor Page?
Sorry. It means that the priorities that are identified must flow from the policies in the local plan, and therefore there are no specific commitments made financially in the local plan, but in taking forward expenditure derived from the SIL and Section 106 payments, they must be in line and support the policies and priorities that are contained in the local plan. If you've got any more detailed points, then feel free to email me, but I hope that clarifies your supplementary.
Thank you, Councillor Page. Thank you, Mr. Metz, for your question. We'll remove you from the meeting now. You're welcome to hang up if you prefer. And you can, of course, watch the rest of the meeting online if you so choose. But thank you for coming along to ask your question. That takes us on then to councillor questions. So we have the question from Councillor White to the lead councillor for Health, Wellbeing and Sport, which I'll be answering on his behalf this evening. So over to you, Councillor White.
Thank you, Chair. This question is on Reading Sports and Leisure memberships, and I submitted it before the lockdown, which has obviously changed things. The question is, a number of my constituents have contacted me about the reduced Reading Sports and Leisure hours and classes at the moment. Can the lead councillor confirm how many people have cancelled their Reading Sports and Leisure memberships since the membership charging started again?
Thank you, Councillor White. Yeah, life comes at you fast at the moment, doesn't it? So the answer, myself on behalf of Councillor Hoskin, 345 people have cancelled their RSL membership since charging restarted. As I answer this question, we are still digesting the announcement of a new national lockdown starting on Thursday, the 5th of November, which is going to close our indoor sports facilities once again. The RSL sites, which comprise Meadway Sports Centre, South Reading Leisure Centre and Palmer Park Sports Stadium, closed on the 16th of March, a few days ahead of the government's instruction to close all indoor gyms and sports facilities nationally in response to the coronavirus pandemic. The impact of the COVID pandemic has had a grave effect on the financial state of leisure centres across the country. UK Active tells us that a third of leisure centres in Britain have still not reopened following the first national lockdown. Here in Reading, we've shown our strong commitment to our sport and leisure services by ensuring all of our centres have reopened. Following government guidance issued at the end of July, the council began a limited and phased reopening of its centres on the 3rd of August. Since then, RSL centres have opened in a progressive fashion, paying particular attention to controlling the risk of infection transmission to both customers and staff. Some of the control measures adopted include reduced opening hours and limiting the activity programme on offer, and this varies from centre to centre. Currently, all 3 RSL sites are open and have gym facilities available, but of course they won't be open from Thursday, the 5th of November. Meadway and South Reading have swimming sessions available and children's swimming lessons have recommenced at Meadway. There is club activity at Palmer Park and South Reading, and both have reopened their artificial sports pitches. Group exercise classes are available at all sites, and whilst this is still reduced compared to the pre-COVID programme, classes have increased from 14 per week at the beginning of August to 56 per week currently. A further 10 were planned to recommence next week. Centre opening hours have increased in line with the activity programme. So very much a sort of something which is in flux as we have a very topical question. Councillor White, did you have a supplementary?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Can you clarify if memberships will be paused again during the lockdown?
Like I say, we're still digesting the effects, but one would imagine that that is going to be the case. Okay, that moves us on then to item number 5, which is decision books, a fairly simple report for noting, listing all of the decision books published since the previous meeting of the committee. I haven't had any requests in advance to speak on this. So can I ask councillors to confirm that we note this report?
Noted.
Agreed.
Wonderful, thank you all. That takes us on then to item 6, endorsement of the Reading Climate Emergency Strategy 2020 to 25 and adoption of the Corporate Carbon Plan 2020 to 25. I've had prior indication on this item from Councillor Page and from Councillor White, and if anybody else wishes to speak, please indicate in the chat function on the meeting. But firstly then, over to Peter Moore to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. The paper before you this evening, councillors, presents 2 key elements of Reading's response to climate change for your endorsement or adoption, and namely the Reading Climate Emergency Strategy for 2020 to 25, which is produced by the Reading Climate Change Partnership, of which the council is a founding member, and our new Corporate Carbon Plan for 2020 to 25, which sets out our organisational contribution to that Reading-wide strategy. On the Reading Climate Emergency Strategy, members may recall we brought a draft of the strategy to Policy Committee in February, which endorsed it for a public consultation which began in March. The plan at the time was to launch the new strategy in July, but as an infamous boxer once said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, and the pandemic was just such a punch. The week after consultation launch, we went into lockdown and took a decision at that point to extend the consultation process and reluctantly move our target launch date for the strategy from July back to November. Thanks to the hard work of partners and colleagues involved in strategy development, we're on course to meet that revised timeline, and the partnership is planning to launch the strategy at a virtual event next Tuesday, the 10th of November, as the centrepiece of a week-long Reading Climate Festival, a series of virtual events hosted by partners and community groups to galvanise commitment to the actions set out in the strategy and engage the whole community in the massive effort we need to deliver the ambition of a net zero Reading by 2030. The Council's formal endorsement of the strategy is therefore being sought prior to next week's launch to add our weight to the partnership's efforts. And Councillor Brock will be speaking at the launch to emphasise our commitment to the strategy. Final version of the strategy is obviously attached to Appendix 1, and a summary of the changes made to the strategy arising from public consultation, which the Council managed on behalf of the partnership, is included at Appendix 2. A net zero borough by 2030 obviously remains a huge challenge, and if we deliver all the actions in the strategy over the next 5 years, we will still be some way from achieving that goal, but it sets out the important enabling actions that we need to take to put us on the right path over that 5-year period. So I have no hesitation in commending that to you for your endorsement this evening. Moving on briefly then to the corporate carbon plan, the key piece of advice to all the councils who've passed climate emergency declarations, as we did in February 2019, is that we need to get our own house in order first, as we've got a much better chance of getting everyone else to sign up to that goal if we show how we're doing it for our own organisation first. And that's the role of the corporate carbon plan. Current plan covering the period 2015 to 2020, which saw us deliver against the 50% reduction target 3 years early. That obviously needs updating now and replacing to reflect the more ambitious 2030 targets, and we've set out in the plan attached to Appendix 3 the steps we need to take between now and 2025 to put us on track. So the headline for that 5-year period is an 85% target reduction by 2025, in the context of already reducing our carbon footprint by 63% against the baseline which we set in 2008. Getting to 85% may not sound a huge stretch, but it still means halving our energy use. And it's worth remembering that every percentage point we get closer to zero becomes increasingly difficult to squeeze out. Energy represents a cost, of course, so delivering the carbon plan should also align with the financial imperatives of controlling our future costs. The intention's always been to launch the new carbon plan simultaneous with the climate emergency strategy so that we can show how we are leading by example, hence bringing both plans to Policy Committee tonight for endorsement or adoption. Perhaps, Chairman, I could just say a huge thank you to colleagues and partners who've contributed to the strategy development process, many doing so in a voluntary capacity or in addition to their very demanding day jobs, which have been particularly difficult over the last period. COVID-19 has inevitably had an impact on the timeline we were working to, but climate change hasn't stopped and we won't be immune to its effects. So we felt it's important to press on as fast as we could. And we know that this issue remains a high priority for residents, despite the pandemic being understandably at the forefront of everyone's minds. So finalising these two plans, I think, represents an important step on our road to net zero. And I think Reading should be pleased with the progress it has made in the difficult circumstances we've faced this year. Members should all now have been invited to the strategy launch on the 10th of November. And I very much hope you'll feel able to support the recommendations in the papers in front of you this evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moore. So first up then I had Councillor Page.
Chair, can I thank Peter for his introduction? As the report makes quite clear in paragraphs 3.3 and 3.4 on page 12, never has a strategy of this sort been more appropriate in terms of the pandemic that is facing us at the present time, the consequences of which will be to require us at local, regional and national level to revise the way in which we do things and to focus also on the essential need to ensure that any recovery is focused very much on protecting and improving the environment locally and nationally. And so the idea of a green recovery, whilst it trips off the tongue very lightly, is harder to deliver. And it's even harder to deliver at a national level where you have a much more confused picture as to priorities. Our local strategy hopefully shows by example the sorts of priorities that we as a council and a local community want to see taken forward in the short, medium and long term. And as Peter rightly says in his introduction, the strategy is the result of a lot of work by partners across the sectors, voluntary, community, private sector, as well as the council and statutory agencies. And I'm delighted that we now have two new joint chairs of the climate change strategy, representing the private sector and the university. And that is a reflection, hopefully, of the widening interest and commitment that we see locally. And I would draw particularly colleagues' attention to the results of the consultation. As Peter said, we had a draft of this earlier in the year. We then had the consultation launched initially, which was then delayed for reasons that he's mentioned. But for the first time in our 12 years of having climate change strategies, we not only had, it wasn't the first time for a consultation, but it's the first time that the results of a consultation have been as clearly tabulated and set out in a report. And I would commend to colleagues Appendix 2, which starts on page 85 and takes each of the themes, analyses the responses and shows what modifications or changes or amendments were made to the strategy. And therefore everybody who contributed to that consultation can see how their contribution fed through to the final strategy. And that is a piece.
Councillor Page, you've muted yourself mid-flow. On the one hand pleasant, on the other hand means we can't hear you.
My apologies, Chair. I've got the papers crept over the dashboard, the board. I'm sorry, I don't know where I was saying about the consultation summary.
We heard you speak about the appendix taking us through all of the changes that have been made and the public's ability to.
Well, I was just saying that it's a first for Reading to have such a detailed analysis of the way in which public responses have impacted and been taken on board in the strategy that is before us this evening. And I would commend Peter particularly for the work that he did in analysing those responses. No responses were ignored, except perhaps for 2 or 3 who called for my head on a spike. So unfortunately they weren't included, and more frivolous ones as well. But the vast majority of responses were serious and were taken seriously and were reflected in that Appendix 2, Chair. So the commitment from the Council, as Peter rightly said in his introduction, and I have said on many occasions, is to say to our community locally that we are leading by example as a local authority, and our carbon plan summarises our commitment to continue to take forward the very good work that we have done over the last 12 years. And the reduction in our carbon footprint as a local authority is one of the highest in the country. And it sets a very high bar for us to continue on in delivering such reductions. But the carbon plan sets out the way in which we intend to do that in order to meet our climate emergency target of 0 emissions by 2030. And I would likewise commend that plan to colleagues. So, Chair, this represents a substantial amount of work by the Council, a number of key officers and our partners. And I think the one message I would want to go out from tonight's hopefully unanimous adoption of this strategy is that we need to see much wider buy-in from particularly smaller and medium-sized businesses in Reading. And I know the times are extraordinarily challenging, particularly for smaller businesses. but the environment is something that should be dear to all of us. It affects all of us, and as an authority we will be playing our part in hopefully securing that wider community buy-in in delivering this very ambitious strategy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Page. So next I had Councillor White.
Thank you, Chair. COVID-19 has taught us that if we don't prepare for a crisis, if we don't act quickly or well, then we will pay a high price. Even though climate change has disappeared from the news, it hasn't gone away. The climate crisis is even more serious than COVID-19. Back when I was younger in years and longer in hair, the first campaign I was ever involved with was to get the council to sign the Nottingham Declaration and produce the first climate change strategy. Today, we have the Reading Climate Emergency Strategy from the Reading Climate Change Partnership and the Reading Council Carbon Plan in front of us. Lots of work has gone into producing these documents, and I'd like to add my thanks to those involved. Green councillors don't agree with everything in these documents, but they are definitely a firm foundation to build upon. To pick out a few areas that we think could be improved, the Friends of the Earth report nationally on councils and climate change highlighted that in Reading we need to be insulating 4,000 homes per year to high levels to cut carbon emissions, but we are still only insulating a small number of homes and not to high enough levels. We also need to be more ambitious for cycling. The targets that we have and that we are soon to adopt in the local transport plan should be higher and should be driving council funding and driving bidding for central government money to allow us to reach higher targets. In a compact town like Reading, cycling should be the first choice for far more journeys than we have at present. We also need a just transition to a new low carbon economy, one that creates jobs and tackles poverty, one that ensures people can heat their homes, one that cuts pollution. Green councillors support action on climate change. We will keep up the pressure and we support the recommended actions in the report.
Can't unmute myself. Hopefully
I was going to say that's me finished.
I know. I was hanging on every word, Councillor White. Councillor Devine.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Again, I'd like to congratulate all concerned in actually putting this document together. It is a massive programme of projects aiming to do our bit in Reading to counter the effects of climate change. I'd just like to point out a couple of things really that seem to lead on from what's in the strategy. The first of which is we seem to be half looking at a local public energy company to help with green energy production. And I think we should be seriously looking at such a thing, a new public company wholly owned by the council, but able to work separately and I think contribute to a lot of the green energy production projects and again things like an anaerobic digester that we could use within our own town. Also, I think another issue in terms of planning, certainly retrofitting all our older housing stock needs to take priority, and it certainly hasn't up to now, but it looks like this is going to be the biggest bugbear in the planning area of this strategy. I also think we probably need to look at introducing a look at how the new buildings are going to produce or buy in their power requirements and make sure that we actually are, if not forcing them into a green power supply, strongly pushing in that direction. On transport, we are still dithering a bit over how to tackle air pollution in the town centre. We seem to have been talking about LEZs and other possible solutions for a number of years already. And I think the time has come in this strategy to make a decision and implement it, because it's the health of our citizens that actually is at stake here, as well as the climate. I also think that we are going to need a much bigger budget for tree planting. It's one of the things I tried to amend the budget for earlier on this year. And I think that that is something we could do a lot more of. Other than that, the biggest issue we've got with the climate change strategy is funding. And I'm not quite sure where all the funding for all of these projects is going to come from. We used to have such a thing as a green investment bank back in the days when Lib Dems were in government, but the Tories tore that one up, although I gather they're actually talking about restarting something like that. But the issue of funding, it's very good having a strategy, but as you can see with retrofitting of our old housing stock, having a strategy doesn't produce the funding to carry out the work necessarily. So we really do need to think about how we're going to finance some of this, and look at taking off either some of our reserves to fund green projects, or at least providing seed finance for other people to help out as well. And lastly, I think there are two issues. One is that the strategy, good that it is, I worry about the democratic control of such a thing, because it seems to be, I don't know whether you call it self-appointed or however it got to come about, but I worry about the lack of democratic control, because I see this as part of an issue, a much wider issue, where with things like the LEP and now the RCCP, although they have councillors sitting on the board, we don't control them as such. So I think that that's something we probably need to look at some point. And again, the last point that actually Councillor Page made about business buy-in, I think is critical. At the moment, I'm not too sure, given the COVID issue, that we are going to find a lot of businesses buying in to a climate strategy. That we have to try and urge them on somehow or other. Again, if we can start to produce funding from our own resources, it might help draw them in. But until then, I worry about whether we are going to get a large-scale business buy-in. I think that's about it, except that we will be supporting this, of course, and it is a huge step forward. Some of the points there, I think we need to talk about further. Thank you, Chair. That's it.
Thank you, Councillor Devine. I have to say, I mean, I think it's right where we seek to work in partnership with others, that councillors and the council doesn't seek to monopolise power. It never seems an appropriate way to foster good, meaningful, long-term and successful partnerships. Next, I had Councillor Rowland.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I would just like to commend all of the hard work that was done to get this to this point, and to note really that in the middle of very sobering news that we have with COVID-19 and another impending lockdown, that this provides a real ray of light, certainly for me, and I hope for the residents of Reading and the councillors this evening. The climate change situation is obviously not going away, and I think we've been very proactive with this document, which is quite extensive, to look at the ways that we can mitigate and come to a carbon zero situation as closely as we can by 2030. But I have to point out also that is not going to be, we are actually leading the way behind the government, which is a bit slower in that. And I want to discuss that a little bit further in a minute. The real thing that I wanted to point out, and one of the positives of this, is a really good expansion on the way that this strategy is looking to involve all of Reading, because it will indeed involve everyone in Reading. No one will escape, and I hope that everyone will be on board. I've been very, very excited as I've been part of the early adopters area with the new food recycling program to see just how well my neighborhood, which we had concerns about, is coming on board to embrace this. And so I do think this is something that speaks to and can speak to absolutely everybody. I know that just even going through it for my own personal interest, I was a clothing designer once. I cannot think of a more wasteful, horrible industry that wastes so much in terms of how clothing winds up in the third world and is burned and wasted. And so I'm delighted to see that on page 37 of the program too, and to think about ways that we can use our resources more carefully and take care of better recycling. Also, to a point that Councillor Devine made, and also Councillor White, I'm obviously, as the Heritage Champion for Reading, I'm very interested about the older house conversions, and the fact of the matter is that is where the government is very seriously lagging. On page 14 of the strategy, it points out the fact that each house would possibly cost approximately £30,000 to convert. That is serious money that we do not have, and without serious government intervention and the government following and coming along more quickly as we are, that cannot happen. We do not have the funding, Councillor Devine, to take care of that, and it's very disappointing. But what we need to be doing is we need to be lobbying our government to get more involved and more quickly on that. So I do want to point out that it really, really does involve everyone. It really, really does have something in it that is of interest to everyone at some point in their life. I was finally very pleased to be part of, or play a small part in the development of the nature scheme in this program. And that was very refreshing because as lead for culture and recreation, obviously trees are of a very large concern to me. And I know Councillor Devine talked about the tree strategy, which the budget was doubled this past year. And obviously, despite COVID-19, this is continuing to be a big concern. But our tree strategy will be one way that is a very tangible way that people can get involved as we look to maybe plant a tree or something like that. We won't achieve our very tough targets for 2030 in terms of tree cover without the rest of the town involved. So I do hope that everyone and every single person in this town takes this as a call to arms and knows that we are armed with a really, really excellent strategy, and something I would certainly commend, and hope that we have some cross-party support this evening on this. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Rowland. Next, I have Councillor Skeets.
Thank you, Chair. We welcome this plan this evening, and we'd like to thank everyone who contributed in the consultation. We really do welcome the commitment from the Council with this plan we have before us this evening. It is a very important report, and it is extensive, and it affects everyone's lives and how we live. Anyone that's gone down to the recycling centre and you see how much at the civic amenities site, and you see how much rubbish is there and how we live and what we discard. Councillor Rowland's quite right when she talks about textiles and garments, and it really makes one stop and think when you go down to that civic amenity site and you see the waste. And this is just our area. You know, when you think of that nationally, then globally, it's quite devastating. So putting this plan together, you know, we should all get behind it. The Conservatives certainly are. We fully support it. It is a foundation. It's the step forward. I'm pleased that I think it was Councillor Rowland that said we're ahead of the game. That's great. But I see this is the way forward, and this is how we should all be thinking. We are all in all this together, to coin a phrase, but we have to take stock of how we live and the waste that we produce, which obviously affects the air we breathe and the carbon that we all emitting. So we very much support this, Chair, and we very much welcome it. And as I say, thank you to all those who took part in the consultation and to the officers who put this together. So yes, we shall be endorsing and adopting this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Skeets. Councillor Page wanted to respond to a few points.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Firstly, picking up on points that Councillor White made, clearly the commitment to retrofitting, and Councillor Devine referred to this as well, is something that we are up for, but we cannot fund it alone. And we cannot simply dip into reserves, as Councillor Devine said, I think quite flippantly, because the scale of the resources required means that central government is going to have to facilitate this process and incentivise it. And so Building Back Greener will hopefully see money borrowed to invest in that sort of strategy. And some of it will hopefully flow to us in Reading. In terms of our own stock, our depleted council stock, then clearly we will be looking to do further investment as we have done to date. In terms of the targets, clearly all the targets are going to be kept under much more regular review. And with regard to cycling, those have already been increased, Councillor White, but we can only offer realistic and increased targets when we are fully aware of the resources that we have been given by government additionally to invest in cycling initiatives. And that, unfortunately, is woefully delayed. We submitted a tranche 2, a second round of bidding to the government back in July, early July. We were promised a decision in September. That went. We were promised a decision by the end of October. That has come and gone. And so until we are advised by the DfT of the scale of any additional resources, it's clearly irresponsible just to pluck figures out of the air. But please rest assured that the targets will be revised and revised upwards. The debate will be to what extent and based on the resources we get from government. Councillor Devine raised an interesting point about a local energy company. He can't surely be suggesting that we set up energy companies just at the time when both Bristol and Nottingham's have fallen flat on their faces and are being wound up. But we are serious in working with like the Reading Community Energy Society and various other projects where I've got our own proposals in the strategy. And I thank Councillor Devine for recycling the remark that I made at the cross-party recycling group last week about RE3 perhaps looking at developing its own anaerobic digester once food waste has been established across all 3 partner authorities. I certainly would caution against looking to have an anaerobic digester within Reading Borough for the obvious reason that we don't have much space. But clearly we will be actively looking through the partnership at that option as we go forward. Councillor Devine talked about dithering about action around air pollution in the town. We're certainly not dithering. Our local transport plan consultation finished a few months ago. We're currently working on the final version of that will appear in the early new year. And the realities of the need to improve air quality in Reading has certainly not been diminished. In fact, the priority, if anything, has increased. And I would make the passing observation, Chair, that there have been some recent research projects, mainly in London, that suggest that poor air quality has actually been a factor in spreading and hastening the spread of the COVID virus. And that clearly, whether that is actually borne out by subsequent studies, it does remind us that the need to improve air quality in the town is a very high one, and that will be reflected in the policy that we, the local transport plan that we bring forward in the new year. And the final point that Councillor Duveen made is an interesting one, because, and you picked up on it, Chair, we cannot dragoon partners, and whilst we have a proper democratic control, and indeed the outing of the draft strategy early this year, as with the strategy coming forward for tonight's approval, the private sector and the voluntary sector obviously do not necessarily have similar structures. And we work in a partnership in a way that, as I said earlier, has to lead by example, but we cannot oblige and should not look to force voluntary organisations and other partners to accept some sort of control by the Borough Council, which would be completely inappropriate. I hope that Councillor Duveen would reflect on that. There may be a lack of control that he wants to see, but there's certainly no lack of transparency, I would suggest, in the process that we have adopted throughout this year. I think, Chair, that I suppose the final point around business buy-in that Councillor Duveen made, this is where central government so far has not set a good example, and where central government has much more to do, and that is to incentivise a transition to a greener economy, and whether that be through fiscal incentives or through legislation and changes around regulations, and that can only be done and should be done at a national level. A good example is the chaotic regime that we have with all the different recycling policies that are a result of a failure by central government to require national recycling standards around that and packaging. And until central government bites the bullet, we will have the continued fragmented situation locally. So central government has a key role to play in taking forward the green recovery by setting that framework that incentivises the private sector to make the sort of changes that are set out in this strategy. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Page. So if I go back to the head of climate strategy then to sort of round things up, and if there are any comments or clarifications you wanted to make, Mr. Moore.
Just two quick things if I could, Chair. Would it be in order for me to post a link in the chat channel which gives details of, just to share a bit of good news, which members may not be aware of, we recently submitted a bid for some funding, which is now coming through a scheme called the Green Homes Grant, to support local authorities with that massive challenge of housing retrofit, which several members referred to. And we've secured £555,000 from that fund, and I can pop a link giving details if that would be helpful in the chat channel.
I'm sure it would be.
Yeah, and the second thing was just to thank councillors really to hear that support across the political groups is immensely helpful to all of us in trying to take this work forward. So I'm grateful for those comments and that support that's been expressed.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. So if we move then to the roll call vote, so I'll go through each councillor alphabetically, starting, and if you're for, against or abstaining, please. Councillor Barnett Ward.
For.
Councillor Devine.
For.
Councillor Jones.
For.
Councillor Page.
For.
Councillor Rowland.
For.
Councillor Skeets.
For.
Councillor Stevens.
For.
Councillor Terry.
For.
Councillor White.
For.
I'm for as well, so recommendations are approved unanimously, and of course I'm sure we'll all be looking forward to the launch event next week on Tuesday. So that actually takes us to the end of the public part of the meeting this evening, because item 9 is in closed session. So I need to move the customary motion as printed, which I shan't read out because it's there and it's on the agenda. And I need to say good night then to members of the press and public, because this will end our live broadcast event this evening. And thank you for coming along.